The light of consciousness must confront the darkness that is its own opposite. Otherwise, it becomes delusion. Have you ever noticed how the harder you try to wake up, the more you seem to lose your balance? You meditate, you read, you fill notebooks with affirmations and promises of inner peace. But when night comes and the noise fades, something inside you still feels empty. There's a subtle ache, like standing before a sacred fire that once comforted you, but now burns too close. You tell yourself it's purification, but deep down, it feels like you're being consumed. That's the paradox of the seeker. The closer you get to the light, the darker your own shadow becomes. Carl Jung once warned, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." Yet everything around us insists the opposite. Our culture worships the bright, the positive, the transcendent. We celebrate people who vibrate higher, who manifest effortlessly, who seem untouched by pain. But behind that glittering mass of illumination hides a fear we rarely admit, the fear of the dark within us. We want to ascend without descending, to heal without feeling, to transcend without transforming. We chase light as if it were salvation, forgetting that light without darkness is blindness. Think of a flame. It gives warmth only because it burns. It illuminates only because it consumes. When you stare into it too long, the world around you disappears, swallowed by brightness. That's what happens when we make spiritual light our idol. We disconnect from instinct, from the raw pulse of life that roots us in the earth. We begin to live not from our soul, but from an idea of what our soul should look like. Pure, peaceful, untouchable. We stop being human and start performing holiness. Our smiles become armor, our serenity a disguise. The irony is that this very chase for transcendence often births the deepest disconnection. The more we try to escape the shadow, the more it grows behind us, larger, denser, waiting. The self that refuses to feel its own darkness becomes inflated, fragile, and dangerously ungrounded. Jung called this the spiritual inflation, when the ego mistakes itself as self and begins to play God with its own psyche. You start to believe you've risen above pain, when in truth, you've only hidden it under layers of light. You quote wisdom instead of living it. You meditate to avoid yourself. Real awakening doesn't lift you above the world. It drops you into its depths. It strips away illusions one by one, until you meet the part of you that trembles in the dark. That's where light is born, not in the escape, but in the embrace. Jung knew that the soul doesn't grow in the comfort of clarity. It grows in the tension between what you are and what you fear to be. The darkness isn't the enemy of light. It's its foundation. Without shadow, there's no contour. Without descent, no ascent. But most seekers never reach that depth. They hover in the glow, intoxicated by it, certain they've arrived. They don't notice the subtle arrogance that whispers, "I am more awakened than others." They don't feel how their empathy hardens into superiority, or how their search for truth slowly turns into a performance of it. That's the tragedy Jung saw coming, the moment when spirituality stops being a path of integration and becomes a theater of avoidance. Because when light is used to deny the dark, it no longer heals. It blinds. It becomes a mirror so bright that you can no longer see who you are. And behind that dazzling glow, something ancient stirs. The very soul that longs for truth begins to fracture under the weight of its own perfection. Because behind the glow of awakening, Jung discovered 7 silent forces that can destroy the very soul that seeks truth. Jung noticed something most seekers never dare to see, that the ego doesn't always appear arrogant, loud, or worldly. Sometimes it dresses in white robes. Sometimes it quotes sacred texts and speaks of love and light. It sits quietly in meditation, nodding with serene superiority, whispering, "You are evolving. You are above others. You are light." And little by little, this voice builds a secret throne inside the soul. It claims to be divine inspiration, but it's only the old ego wearing a halo. That's how the most dangerous illusion is born, not in darkness, but in radiance. Jung called this process inflation, the moment when the conscious mind identifies with an archetype, especially the archetype of the wise or holy one. It's the seduction of light. The ego merges with something vast and archetypal, mistaking borrowed power for true transformation. You start to speak, as if the universe itself were speaking through you. Every insight feels like revelation, every emotion like divine guidance. But beneath this mystical glow, something vital fades, the raw, human self that once trembled, doubted, and longed for meaning. The light becomes a mirror reflecting your imagined greatness, not a torch that illuminates your wounds. In Os Archetypos eo inconscient cultivo, Jung warned that whoever seeks divine experience without grounding in the personal unconscious falls victim to archetypal forces that devour individuality. It's a haunting truth. The moment you lose touch with your shadow, the archetypes, those immense psychic patterns, take over. The ego, swollen by spiritual energy, forgets its limits and begins to drift. It stops being human and becomes an abstract idea of holiness. What was once a journey of depth turns into a performance of light. You feel enlightened, but you're actually possessed by the image of enlightenment itself. We see it everywhere, the subtle rigidity that hides behind soft words. The awaken, who no longer laugh, who fear being seen angry or sad. The ones who preach detachment but tremble at intimacy, who confuse repression with peace. The ones who insist they've transcended duality, yet secretly judge anyone still wrestling with it. This is the ego's masterpiece, a spirituality so polished that it no longer has room for life's rough edges. It is pure, yes, but sterile. In chasing divine perfection, they forget divine humanity. Jung believed that individuation, the true awakening, is not about escaping the human, but integrating it. It's not climbing toward the heavens. It's descending into the roots where soul and shadow meet. The more one denies imperfection, the more it festers in the dark. And so, many seekers end up worshiping their own reflection, confusing the glow of ego inflation with the light of the self. They talk about love but can't stand confrontation, about awareness but refuse to look inward, about freedom but live imprisoned by their image of purity. The tragedy is that what begins as genuine longing for truth can end in subtle arrogance. The ego doesn't destroy the journey. It hijacks it. It takes the language of spirit and uses it to protect itself from change. It says, "You've already arrived. You no longer need to question, to feel, to doubt." And that's when the seeker stops growing. The light that once guided them now blinds them to everything imperfect, everything real. Have you ever noticed how the pursuit of purity can make people less human, less compassionate, more rigid, more certain? That's the first danger, when your search for light becomes a mask the shadow wears. But what happens when this light begins to silence everything that feels too human? Anger, desire, sadness? You meditate to feel peace, but you repress rage. You forgive, but never allow yourself to grieve. You say everything is love, but secretly fear your own jealousy. This is a fracture of the modern seeker, the split between the self you show and the one you silence. Jung called it the repression of the shadow, the moment you decide that only half of you deserves to exist. You begin to curate your soul, editing out the parts that don't fit the image of enlightenment. Anger becomes low vibration, sadness becomes unawakened, and every human impulse is filtered to the need to appear serene. You stop feeling life and start managing it. In daily life, this appears as what psychologists call spiritual bypassing, using spirituality to escape pain instead of facing it. The healer, who avoids conflict to protect their energy. The empath, who never says no because compassion feels holier than boundaries. The awakened, one who can't stand imperfection, neither in others nor in themselves. On the surface, they seem peaceful, but underneath, their inner world suffocates under the weight of all that's unspoken. Every emotion denied becomes a ghost haunting the edges of consciousness, and eventually, those ghosts demand to be seen. Jung warned of this danger. The light of consciousness must confront the darkness that is its own opposite, otherwise it becomes delusion. A natural reason of the psyche, section 138. Whatever you reject doesn't vanish. It grows in the dark. The unconscious compensates for every one-sided attitude. The more you cling to the idea of being only light, the more violently the shadow pushes back through anxiety, projection, or burnout. The person who prides themselves on being endlessly calm suddenly erupts in anger. The one who preaches detachment finds themselves obsessed. The one who denies sadness wakes up to a life that feels hollow. The psyche always seeks balance, even if it has to break you to find it. You can't escape darkness without losing depth. The moment you exile pain, you exile meaning too. That's why the most radiant people often carry exhaustion. They're at war with half their being. The self that wants to shine keeps suppressing the self that wants to scream. And the irony? The energy spent avoiding darkness could have been the fuel for transformation. Jung saw this split as the wound of modern spirituality. We mistake repression for transcendence, control for peace, indifference for wisdom. But peace that depends on avoidance isn't peace. It's paralysis. The soul doesn't want perfection. It wants wholeness. Because the more you chase transcendence, the more the unconscious demands descent. Growth without grounding isn't evolution, it's escape. The shadow will not be denied forever. It waits in silence, gathering power in the calm you mistake for serenity. But what happens when you ignore that pull for too long? When the shadow you've denied finally comes to collect its debt? Those who chase the light without roots eventually face its shadow, the dark night of the soul. It rarely announces itself with thunder. It begins quietly. A few sleepless nights. Irritability that meditation no longer soothes. A strange loss of direction, as if the compass inside suddenly spins. Then comes a silence that no mantra can fill. The practices that once felt divine turn mechanical. The affirmations feel hollow. The high vibrations fade into static. And beneath the spiritual confidence, something trembles, a faint, terrified voice asking, "Who am I if not this light I built?" This is the moment when the structures of meaning collapse. The spiritual ego that once spoke with certainty begins to crumble, revealing not a saint, but a frightened child who was using light as armor. Jung saw this as the second great danger of awakening, psychic disintegration. When the shadow is denied for too long, it doesn't disappear, it erupts. The ego, swollen with archetypal energy, suddenly collapses under a force it cannot control. The person calls it a spiritual crisis, but psychologically, it's closer to an implosion of identity. What was once a search for transcendence becomes a confrontation with the abyss. In the ego and the unconscious, Jung described this as a regression of consciousness into collective layers of the psyche. The mind, having flown too close to the sun, falls back into the ocean of the collective unconscious, where ancient symbols awaken like storms. Gods and demons no longer live in myths. They live inside you. Archetypes flood consciousness, each demanding worship, each insisting on being the truth. The visionary feels chosen one moment and cursed the next. They see signs everywhere, feel messages and coincidences, and mistake psychic fragmentation for revelation. The light that was meant to guide has devoured its seeker. But Jung never dismissed this descent as madness alone. He knew the psyche is self-regulating. It seeks wholeness, even through chaos. When one side grows too dominant, the other rises to restore balance. The psyche, he wrote, compensates every one-sidedness. What we experience as breakdown is often a deeper order trying to reassert itself. The fall is not punishment, it's correction. The dark night strips away every illusion the light inflated. It tears off the mask of enlightenment, so the authentic self can finally breathe. Still, few endure this passage willingly. The ego resists dissolution, fighting to keep its old image intact. But resistance only prolongs the pain. The more you cling to the persona of the awakened one, the more violently the unconscious dismantles it. Jung compared this process to alchemy, the burning of the false gold so that true gold can emerge. You are not being destroyed. You are being refined. The collapse, however terrifying, is sacred surgery. And so, what feels like the end is often the beginning of real transformation. The night does not come to punish you. It comes to restore your soul to truth. So if destruction hides transformation, what did Jung find as a true path through this crisis? The true awakening, Jung insisted, is not a flight upward but a descent inward. It begins the moment you stop running from your contradictions and dare to hold them in the same breath. Most people think awakening is about climbing higher, more peace, more clarity, more light. But Jung's map of transformation points the opposite way, toward wholeness, not purity. Individuation is not self-improvement. It's self-encounter, the radical acceptance that you are both the saint and the sinner, the light and the wound. Step 1. Recognition. You begin by admitting that the darkness is part of you, that envy, pride, fear, and pain are not failures of spirit, but expressions of life asking to be seen. When you stop labeling your emotions as good or bad, they begin to reveal their hidden purpose. Anger shows where your boundaries are weak. Envy shows where your potential sleeps. Sadness shows what your soul values most. Jung believed that until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. Recognition is the first act of reclaiming your fate. Step 2. Dialogue. Once you see the shadow, you must learn to converse with it. The unconscious doesn't speak in words. It speaks in symbols, dreams, slips, and moods. It paints its truth in metaphors. When a dream disturbs you or a reaction feels irrational, pause and ask, what is trying to reach me through this? Jung saw this dialogue as sacred work. The ego listening to self. To interpret the language of symbols is to build a bridge between your inner and outer worlds. Step 3. Integration. True healing happens not by erasing conflict, but by holding opposites until they reconcile. Jung called this the transcendent function, the mysterious capacity of the psyche to unite contradictions into a new harmony. It's when light and dark, masculine and feminine, spiritual and earthly stop fighting and begin to dance. Integration is not perfection. It's participation in life's full spectrum. To be whole is to be able to contain both serenity and storm without losing center. Step 4. Action. Transformation that remains theoretical isn't transformation at all. You must live what you've learned. Set boundaries when you once avoided them. Tell the truth where you used to hide. Practice compassion without self-erasure. Spirituality that doesn't touch daily life becomes illusion. The real sign of growth is not how long you can meditate, but how honestly you can love, how courageously you can stay present in discomfort. As Jung wrote, the self is a circle whose center is everywhere and whose circumference is nowhere. A Natureza de Psyche, section 423. To live from that center is to stop chasing the sun and realize you already carry it within. The journey was never about escaping the world, but about remembering that the divine lives at the heart of your humanity. But even on this path of balance, there are traps so subtle that most seekers fall again. The closer you get to awakening, the subtler the ego becomes. It no longer seeks attention or wealth. It seeks holiness. It stops shouting and starts whispering sacred truths in your own voice. Jung called this the final stage of inflation, when the ego merges so perfectly with the image of the self that it believes it is a self. What was once a journey of humility becomes a performance of divinity. And if you're not careful, this is where many seekers lose themselves again, not in darkness, but in too much light, the savior complex. It begins innocently. You feel compassion for others still asleep, and you want to help. But soon, helping turns into preaching. You start to believe it's your duty to awaken the world. Jung warned that this is a shadow of the healer archetype, the will to power hiding behind compassion. You stop meeting people where they are and begin trying to lift them where you think they should be. True service heals through humility, not superiority. When your light becomes a weapon conversion, it no longer heals, it blinds. Isolation. As awareness deepens, you start to feel different. Ordinary conversations feel shallow. You withdraw, telling yourself it's solitude, but what you've really chosen is exile. Jung saw this withdrawal as another face of ego inflation, the illusion that your uniqueness separates you from humanity. But individuation is not separation, it's participation. The soul, when cut from life, begins to wither. Growth demands contact with the world, the noise, the conflict, the love. Without relationship, the inner journey collapses into sterile introspection. Inflation by insight. Each new realization feels like a crown. You collect symbols, quote sages, speak of dreams and synchronicities as if they were credentials. But in the quiet moments, your heart feels empty, because knowledge without embodiment is still ignorance. Jung believed that insight must transform behavior, not just vocabulary. When understanding replaces experience, you stop evolving. You no longer grow. You decorate your cage with wisdom. Regression to bliss. When life feels too heavy, you retreat into meditation or fantasy. You call it presence, but it's escape. Jung saw this as regression, the ego fleeing reality for the safety of the womb-like light. The problem is, no one can live in perpetual transcendence. The soul came to earth to feel, to act, to love, to fail, to rise. Enlightenment that denies humanity becomes anesthesia. The world doesn't need more enlightened spectators. It needs awakened participants. In Os Archetypos eo inconscient cultivo, Jung wrote, "Whoever looks into the water sees his own image, but what he sees is not the self. It is the shadow of his own light. The moment you think you've arrived, you've fallen again into reflection, not reality. The final illusion is believing that awakening has an end point. True consciousness has no finish line. It expands forever. The self is not a destination, but a living process, one that humbles even as it elevates. Yet if you can survive these final illusions, something extraordinary begins to unfold, something beyond both light and dark. At the end of the journey, something quiet begins to unfold. The seeker who once chased a light and feared the dark finally understands that they were never separate. Light and darkness are not enemies. They are two wings of the same soul, each incomplete without the other. You walk now through the night without trembling, because you've learned that the same fire that burns also purifies. Every fall, every doubt, every heartbreak was never proof of failure. It was initiation. The darkness didn't destroy you. It taught you to see. This is a return Jung spoke of. Not a triumphant escape into transcendence, but a homecoming into wholeness. You no longer need to shine brighter than others, because you've discovered the light that asks for nothing. It doesn't seek to impress. It simply is. You stop seeking God in distant heavens and start feeling the divine pulse within ordinary life. In the quiet rhythm of your breath, in the stillness between thoughts, in the simple act of being fully here. The sacred no longer hides in temples or theories. It lives in your limitations, in your relationships, in the raw truth of each moment. Jung called this state individuation, the sacred marriage between the human and the divine, the ego and the self. It's the moment your fragmented parts find their rightful place within a greater pattern. You realize that light without shadow is blindness, and shadow without light is despair. True balance is not neutrality, it's presence. It's standing in the middle of life's paradoxes and saying, I can hold it all. You learn that the goal was never to become pure but whole, to live so honestly that even your flaws become prayers. And now, when storms return, and they always will, you no longer ask, why me? Instead, you whisper, here too, I am being shaped. You see that every ending is a hidden beginning, every descent a disguised ascent. You stop dividing life into good and bad, holy and profane, and start seeing everything as part of the same alchemy. The fire of becoming. Wholeness is not peace without pain. It's peace that can stand inside pain. You no longer chase the light. You embody it. You walk through darkness with open eyes, knowing it cannot consume you. You've learned that transformation isn't about becoming someone new. It's about remembering who you've always been. The gold was never outside. It was a fire within, waiting for you to return. Final phrase. The light you seek was never above you. It was within. If this message resonated, take a moment to breathe and comment below. I choose wholeness over perfection.